Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Raleighs Answer webinar series, the aftermath of COVID-19, the new social impact ecosystem. Today, we are going to open a discussion around the use of system thinking in social change. That's a very critical topic that has always been important, but with the eruption of the pandemic, it became even more important and timely. And we are honored today to have a great guest speaker with us to lead the discussion, Cynthia Reiner. Cynthia is a researcher, writer, and lecturer affiliated with the Bertha Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town, Graduate School of Business. Her research focuses on how organizations and communities work to shape social systems in collective ways. Cynthia's work in social change began when, as a recovery management consultant, she joined the LGT Impact Fellowship, which brought her to South Africa for more than a decade. She has served in several organizations, including Generation Ubuntu, an after-school program educating children in Cape Town. Mothers to Mothers, an African social enterprise employing women to guide other women to good health, and the Starfish Great Hearts Foundation, a nonprofit supporting children and families in South Africa. Cynthia holds a bachelor degree from Georgetown University, an MBA from INSEAD, and is currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Cape Town, and she lives in Austin, Texas. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for making the time. We truly appreciate you being here today with us, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you, Ali, for inviting me to be here today. And thank you to the Gerhardt Center for hosting me. I'm just going to pull my slides up here and we can get started. I think we do have access to our chat box. So I would love if, while we get started, if everyone could put into the chat box their name as well as where they are dialing in from, just so that we can get a sense of where everyone is coming from. It would be nice to just see everyone's names and geographies. And it's great to see a few friendly faces in here. So wonderful to have you. Thank you for joining. Okay, so what I thought I would do today is we're going to be talking about the book that my co-author, Francois Bonici, who is the founding director of the Bertha Center, and myself, we published a book called The Systems Work of Social Change earlier last year. And this book was really a 5-year endeavor, a research project that really turned into an exploration of social change for both of us. And I'll spend time walking through the framework of the book, but I wanted to start by talking about why did this book get written? Why were we interested in this topic? Why do we need to explore systems approaches to social change? And I would say that this exploration began even before the formal research began. Both Francois and I were spending time in organizations, in nonprofit organizations, Francois primarily in the medical field, myself in organizations that were positioned in South Africa. And we were realizing that a lot of the work that we were doing was feeling frustrating, that many times we felt like we were not addressing the root causes of problems, but rather just addressing symptoms. And in this exploration, we were conscious that there was a kind of a global conversation happening around this term called systems change. This was maybe 8 years ago when this term systems change was coming to the fore. And we heard that these conversations that were happening primarily, I would say, in the global north. They were happening at conferences, amongst funders, in academic circles. But then, of course, we were experiencing the work at the Bertha Center, and we were coming into close contact with organizations, activists, social justice organizations that really had a different conceptualization of what systems change looked like, who should drive the change, who had the power and who should have the power, and why change should look the way it should. And we were concerned that these two conversations, one happening in the global north, one happening in the global south, were not really coming together to have a conversation together. In fact, we were concerned that some of the conversation around systems change was in fact trying to entrench the status quo, and that in fact we weren't using that conversation to move towards equity and justice in the ways that we saw many of the organizations in South Africa and in other countries pushing towards. So at this time, we were invited by the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship to do research with a number of organizations across the global south and to spend time with them understanding what was their concept of systems change. What did they believe that systems approaches to social change could look like? And what we found were very different conversations about systems change happening in these organizations. And oftentimes organizations very much working to address rooted problems rather than just symptoms through many different tactics that we were not seeing talked about at the highest levels and at the funder levels and at the policy levels. And we wanted to bring those two conversations together. So I wanted to just start out by making sure that that background was understood before we talk about these, because when I talk about systems work, I'm not going to be talking about a lot of the systems thinking frameworks that you may have been introduced to, and in particular in pursuit of mapping the system, but thinking about systems mapping in a different way, thinking about analyzing systems in a different way, thinking about actually approaching systems in a way that really looks at the day-to-day work, not just the high level, how do we analyze and how do we intervene, but how do we do the day-to-day work. So with that preface, let's jump in. I just want to start by talking about our approach to social change. And when I talk about our approach, I'm talking about a very dominant narrative in the world right now about how social change should happen. And many of you may subscribe to these beliefs, but many of you may not. But there is a dominant narrative about how social change should occur that we're operating within, whether we like it or not. And much of this is driven by an industrial mindset, which is 200 years in the making, perhaps even further. And with this mindset, we choose to exchange large sums of money from different sources, and we try to put them and place them towards technical goals to stave off poverty, to pursue health initiatives, and to eliminate poverty, to eliminate hunger, many different issues, but this kind of transactional approach, this technical approach is really the dominant narrative within which we all operate. And in the book, we actually explore this over 200 years. We go through the real historical reasons that we have this approach today. And with this mindset, one of the things that we have come to realize, and some of the problems are throwing up unintended consequences, because the social challenges that we are trying to achieve are not the types of technical problems that we have always been trained to pursue. So these are complex adaptive systems that we're operating in. Those are social systems, and they have different features than some of the more kind of manufacturing or production-oriented problems that we've been trained to solve. And so what are these features? I don't think that any of these are revolutionary. I think many of you would agree if you've spent any time in your own social context, but our problems are complex, they're large scale, and they have depth. And we're going to look at each of these features together. So what do we mean by complexity? This might have been something that you're exploring in your classrooms or in even previous webinars, but I wanted to talk a little bit about complexity before we dive into the other features. First of all, when you have complex systems, they're relationship-based. So you can't just analyze them in their parts. The sum is more than the parts. So and because we can't isolate the parts, we have to analyze them in relationship to one another. Also, the interesting thing about complex systems is that even if we all analyze the same system, we will come up with different formulations of the problem. And many of you, I'm sure, have been in conversations where you can look at a complex issue and there will be disagreement on how you should approach the issue. And rather than looking at that as a bad thing, we should look at that as a good thing, because many solutions are actually going to get us closer to what we need to do rather than single solutions. There's no endpoint to these problems, so the more we know about them, the more we will find out, the more we will learn, and the more we'll have to consider the problem further. So this ending point, this idea that a problem can be solved, is actually a misnomer. I don't even know if we should use those terms, solutions. Instead, we should think of unique situations and contexts, and we should think about solutions as being true or false. What happened here? Asking probing questions that allow us to get to whether or not something has been giving us other answers, and can we use that to get further into the problem, rather than looking at them as good, poor, or yes, no, or silver bullet solutions. The second piece to the problems that we're looking at is that they are large scale. And this term scale has become a really important term in the field of social change. And we'll explore that just a little bit about what do we mean by scale. But I think at a very simple level, what we can agree is that we learn more about the problems and we see more of the problems, and we can see them across larger geographies and populations. And because we're pattern making beings, we can see that there are patterns across these geographies, and it makes us want to solve them in larger contexts. However, because we're working with wicked problems or complex problems, and they have no stopping point, we can see more of them as we learn. And so that idea of getting to the root issue becomes more and more problematic the more we dig. So why is this a problem based on the way we look at scale right now? Well, unfortunately, because of that technical and industrial mindset that I was talking about earlier, we often define scale in terms of efficiency. So we want to put marginally higher impact through the system as throughput, and we want to have more impact. So we talk about scaling a solution or scaling an organization. But what is difficult about these complex adaptive problems in the societies in which they arise is that we actually don't have a good idea of how a system responds to interventions. So if we go back to just the very, very simple definition of scale, it's really how does a system respond to a size change? How does it respond as it gets bigger or smaller? And because we don't always fully understand how scale works in complex adaptive systems, if we try to just put throughput in the system, we will often be disappointed. So third feature is this idea of depth. And this is kind of a word that we've put in there. It doesn't mean a whole lot until you really start to explore, well, what do we mean by it? And really, when we talk about depth, we're looking at the deeply held beliefs, the values, the assumptions, the qualities. And these are things that are extraordinarily difficult to shift because they arise out of culture and they arise out of the context in which we reside. And oftentimes, our systems fail when they entrench our beliefs to the extent that we cannot even imagine change, that those narratives become so entrenched that to conceive of something new, it becomes almost impossible. I think it's really important for us to also recognize that we are the systems that we seek to change. Despite, maybe a lot of information and being able to see something from a big picture view, we are not scientists manipulating variables in a lab. In fact, we are participating in systems, even when we study them, even when we try to intervene to make them better. We often participate them, not fully acknowledging the biases that we bring, and so we can maintain and extend them just by the very fact of operating in them. So we always have to be fully conscious of the biases, the beliefs that we bring into the system when we are trying to make change. Okay, let's jump into the framework that I'm going to be talking about today, which is the framework of systems work. Again, like I said, we were able to do research across several organizations that were claiming or saying that their work was systematic in nature, and really trying to understand, well, what is it that they are doing that is systematic? And all of the organizations that we studied had scaled to a large degree. They were large funded organizations with a long history and with very strong evidence of impact. So we weren't needing to go in and see, is the work that they are doing actually valid? In fact, in most cases, in all cases, these were organizations that had really been lauded for having substantial impact. But what we wanted to know is, what are the things that they are doing that are considered systemic in nature? How are they intervening in a system to make sure that they're addressing root causes rather than symptoms? And what we found was something different than what we expected. We found that oftentimes the work that they were doing was not about traditional scale, about replication, or about, packaging it up in a box and having other organizations do their work or governments do their work, but rather, in fact, that they were building this responsivity and this representation into their programs and into their systems so that they could evolve and adapt to what they needed to be to best serve the constituents in that system. And what were they doing to do that? We had 3 principles that emerged from all of our interviews and our experiences of being with these organizations. The first was that they were offering the fostering of connection amongst primary actors. We'll talk about what that means. But that fostering of connection in a systems context is about creating those new relationships. So if you're operating in a complex adaptive system where in fact it's the relationships that often create the change you seek to make, by fostering connection amongst groups that would not have previous connections, you can truly change the way a system responds to a problem at hand. Secondly, they were working to really embrace context by ensuring the capacity of those grassroots actors who could make decisions on a day-to-day basis and make decisions that were best for their own communities, their own families, and their own larger groups that they had become part of through that process of fostering of connection. And lastly, these organizations were reconfiguring power so that those first 2 things could be done in perpetuity, so that they could become leaders in their communities, so that they could have real political decision-making power, so that they could have the changes that they wanted to see in their communities happen over the long term. Okay, let's keep going. So let's see what this looks like in the real world. The first I want to talk about is that primary actor term that I used. We spent a lot of time looking at each of these organizations and trying to understand who do they believe should drive the change. And really what came out as a very fundamental theme amongst these organizations was that they wanted to ensure that individuals and groups at the point of greatest complexity in the system were being able to drive the change. And you'll see what I mean by this as we go through the case studies. So this first principle of fostering connection, we saw that organizations were building these collective identities. They were trying to stay together while learning. They were building truly durable relationships between people who would not otherwise be together and ensuring that they had a collective identity that would keep them together while learning through change. Oh, I'm actually going to jump ahead. No, I'm going to stay here. Okay, and then the second thing, this embracing of context, they were really trying to work with a plurality of solutions. That's kind of ensuring, like I said before, that you don't have a single solution, but rather that you have many solutions that can meet the emerging needs of a specific context. And we'll talk about how that's done in the real world. And then principle 3, this idea of reconfiguring power. This is really ensuring that primary actors are in their positions of decision-making over the long term. Okay, so most of these things are done at the principle level. So organizations were believing these things, but how were they actually realizing it in their programs, in their organizations, and in the work that they were doing in the world? Well, we saw that ensuring primary actors were at the heart of the change process was done through 4 practices. And these 4 practices are what we're going to dive into now. And they are cultivate collectives, equipping of problem solvers, promoting of platforms, and disrupting policies and patterns. We'll go into each of these. And for each of these, we're going to look at a case study. And the case study really kind of goes from the top and it goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And the reason why I want to tell you this is because many organizations that we meet, or organizations even that we found or work for, will often talk about the context in which they work. So the context of poverty or the context of lower quality education. And then they'll talk about the surface work they're doing. So what is the program? What's the intervention? What am I actually doing here? And who am I doing it for? But oftentimes below that surface work, there are many principles and practices of systems work that are happening, but are not being called out as being the really important work of the organization. And we believe that by calling up these deep principles and practices, we can actually start to see how organizations drive systems work in the real world. And we can actually try and encourage and fund this work in greater number. So let's look at the first one. You'll see a picture here of an organization called R Labs. They're an organization based in South Africa. They were founded in Cape Town by a couple, Marlon and Renee Parker. And really, we studied our labs over a period of many years and tried to understand what it was that they were doing to create this new web of relationships. We realized, and they were the ones that really pointed us towards this idea of creating a collective identity that keeps people together while learning. And the couple of things that they were doing, the tactics that they were using to cultivate these collectives, the first is that they were creating a we. So this is the collective identity. They were creating an actual organization that felt as if they were belonging to something bigger than themselves. The second thing that they are doing is shifting the stigmatization of often living in a marginalized community, in an impoverished community, and belonging to gangs or becoming part of the drug culture, and trying to shift that to a point of pride. So trying to insert a new identity that actually was a prideful identity, in this case, technology. They were also doing something called hosting havens. They were creating safe spaces in communities where former gang members and former drug dealers could actually come in and become part of a new project, usually based around technology. And it was a safe space that they could become not only connected to one another, but actually create a new identity for themselves. And then lastly, they were using this tactic, a social movement tactic called pooling. They were actually creating these spaces so that people could share their experiences, and through sharing those experiences, start to move beyond them. So let's even dig a little bit further. I'm gonna have to jump ahead a little bit here. Nope, I don't have it. Sorry, there's just one slide missing, but I want to very much dig deeper a little bit into how they were doing this. So in the cultivating of collectives, like I said, there's surface work that our labs is using, and that surface work is really building technology companies. So they'll bring in people from the community and give them technology training, but oftentimes they'll pull them into projects that they create themselves that then become technology entities and technology enterprises, which can be spun off into full-fledged entities of their own. And by doing that, there is this belief that they become technology entrepreneurs, a true belief, an actual thing that happens to them. So being from that marginalized community and now becoming a technology entrepreneur is a shift in identity. And only through that shift in identity can they start to change the behaviors that they have or the beliefs that they have about themselves in their communities. Our labs has actually grown to be a franchise model, which has spread all around sub-Saharan Africa. And they have numbers that are very, very impressive. But it is this work, a very small work of creating new identities for individuals that truly becomes the part and parcel of their work. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The second organization that I want to talk to you about is Mothers to Mothers. And this is an organization that I believe really, sorry guys, my slides are just a little bit off here. I want to talk to you about equipping problem solvers, which is the second practice that we called out under systems work. So when we talk about equipping problem solvers, we're talking about really building the capacity of primary actors to be contextually responsive. And that term contextually responsive is something that we realized was happening in many of these organizations. So let's talk about an organization like Family Independence Initiative. Family Independence Initiative is an organization that creates communities of people that come together and that are all committed to moving themselves out of poverty. Interestingly enough, Family Independence Initiative says that they do not help, they do not provide services. In fact, if one of their employees provides services to any of their clients, they will fire them. They've actually, in some cases, had to let employees go because they've said, this is not what we do. We do not help individuals. Instead, we provide the possibility for individuals to help themselves. And how do they do that? Family Independence Initiative creates these peer groups, and this is their surface work. They create peer groups for families to lift themselves out of poverty. And the way that this embraces context is that it allows individuals within these groups to take the information that they have from each other and be able to spend time with each other, learning from what they have done and share good practices. And then in a broader group across many different families, be able to actually start to find out what other families have done, start to lift themselves out of poverty, share the way that they are handling their finances, the way that they are equipping themselves with assets, the way that they are moving out of poverty with each other. And we call this economies of trust. So they're actually using the data that they are learning from each other. There's a technology platform where they can start to journal their behaviors and learn from each other. They can start to actually make one-on-one decisions in these small groups that will lift themselves out of poverty. Now, Family Independence Initiative has some incredible impact data, which shows that, in fact, their service provides more families with a pathway out of poverty than other more traditional programs. But I think what's most interesting is the fact that they are able to connect individuals with one another and create I would call it small data, the information amongst each other so that they can do it themselves. This is not a service level entity, rather it's an equipping and ensuring that families are helping themselves. Okay, practice 3, let's jump into promoting platforms. An organization that we're going to talk about here is Child and Youth Finance International. So we spent time with Child and Youth Finance International over a couple of years, and we were trying to understand how it was that they had built a platform for countries to learn from one another about the policies that they were promoting for economic inclusion of children. And let's talk a little bit about how they do this. So the context is that children's and families' futures are hindered by the lack of financial services, and their service work is trying to ensure that programs and policies for financial and social education were provided. But essentially, even beneath that, there was a much larger piece of ensuring that each of these countries could take the best learnings from that platform and then go and configure it for their own context. So they were promoting this platform where many countries were able to come and learn from each other. They were able to flexibly collaborate, and they were able to drive large-scale change through that. An interesting piece about Child and Youth Finance as well is that we saw that they observed rituals, celebrations. They had award ceremonies. They had chances for everyone to get together and celebrate things, milestones that they were achieving. And all of this created momentum amongst what they would have called a movement in order to drive country level change, which then would drive change at a political and a policy level. Okay, and last piece around disrupting policies and patterns. This really strongly connects to the reconfiguration of power. And what we found here was that in many cases, when we talk about the shifting of power, we talk about changing the rules. So we really try and we focus our attention on the policies that are happening, and that becomes the milestone or the achievement that we hold up. But in fact, what we found in many of these organizations was that the policies themselves were just the starting point. In many cases, it was really about changing the ways of being within a political context so that those primary actors that we spoke about are able to hold formal and enduring positions of power. So the organization that we looked at here is an organization called Nidan. Nidan is working in a couple of states of India, and they're working with informal workers. And in the context of this, informal work is seen as a temporary and unlawful state of employment. But what Nidan has done is that instead of looking at it as a temporary state, rather think about it as an important piece to the economic puzzle. And so their surface work, the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis is often about advancing the rights and livelihoods of informal workers. But essentially what they're truly doing is trying to reconfigure power so that informal workers have formal and enduring positions of power in the political context over the long term. What are they doing in order to do that? One example that I can give you is that they spent a lot of time trying to promote the policy for street vendors in India. And they went as far as, over the course of many, many years, having the passage of the Street Vendors Act in India, which changed the legal status of street vendors. But what they found was that that wasn't enough. So just changing the rules wasn't enough to change the system. In fact, what they needed to do was change changed the way power showed up in those local contexts. And so much of their work now has been done to implement that policy at the local level, setting up committees for town vending so that informal workers can actually have a position and a voice in the way municipal decisions are made. So what I'd really like to point out here about the reconfiguration of power is that it doesn't make, it's not enough just to promote policies that on paper change the way power configuration works. It has to happen through also the patterns of behavior. And organizations can work to promote these new policies, but they also need to work at the pattern level. And iterating between these two pieces is a really important piece to systems work. Okay, so I'm just going to put this slide up here. We're not going to do this together, obviously, but I wanted to give it to you as a possible action that you can take away from this. And this is really thinking about when you're, for example, mapping the system that you are trying to intervene in or sit within, that you really need to think about who are the primary actors in your system. So identifying those primary actors as being the true driver of change is going to truly help understand the system in new ways and to create responsive and representative ways that a system can operate, rather than thinking about how can the organization itself or even political actors can make a difference. It's most important to think about how can the primary actors make decisions and make changes for themselves. It's also important to think about the system's relationships in terms of these four things. How can you change the way a system relates to one another by thinking about cultivating collectives? So these are groups of primary actors that can come together to have greater power and voice. But it starts with a collective identity, a way of seeing themselves that is different and new. Secondly, equipping problem solvers. So ensuring that those primary actors have the ability to make decisions, to circulate data amongst themselves, and to be able to make small changes that coalesce into big changes. So this ability to equip problem solvers is the key to making sure that all changes can happen in a contextual basis. And then at a broader level, how can platforms be built so that organizations, groups of collectives can actually come together to drive change together, to learn from each other, to identify best practices and ensure that they can carry forward change together. And then lastly, these policies and patterns. There is the more kind of paper-based, if I can, of policies, of ensuring that a policy is passed that can change who becomes the player in the political environment, but there's also the patterns of behavior, and both of those are important. So how can an organization shift those policies and patterns so that they can create voice and opportunities for primary actors to have positions of power going forward? And thinking about what tactics you might use to promote these practices. I'm happy to share these slides, and in these slides there are different tactics for each of these practices that can be used in order to make those come to fruition. We didn't have time to go through them today, but I can certainly share those to all of you. Okay, I think that's it for now on the talking. I feel like I've been very one way. I would love to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for a very insightful presentation. It's really like a different way to look at systems, as you said in the beginning. I'll just ask you a question, and then we open the discussion, open the floor for more questions from the audience. In your book, you talked about the power of small data and networks in system change, and how collective identity is important to lead the process of data transfer. Could you please talk a bit about like some techniques the organizations you work with use to collect data in communities where data transfer was challenging, like if they face some resilience and how they dealt with it?
Thanks, Carmen. This is a great question and very interesting one. So we distinguish between what we call small data transfer and big data circulation. So small data is just the things that we share on a day-to-day basis. These are the anecdotes of life. And in the organization that I highlighted, Family Independence Initiative, it's really those small groups that come together on a regular basis to journal and to share about their pathway out of poverty, where that small data happens, that small data sharing happens. So this is the same type of conversation that we all have with our friends and our peers and our family about how am I going to do something different in my life? Am I going to save to buy a house? Am I going to buy in that neighborhood so that I can send my kids to a good school? Each of these things, we don't think of them as data, but they're actually really important pieces of data. And if we can share them with each other and try to help each other along, then we can oftentimes change the trajectory of our lives. But the big data transfer is also interesting. So big data, as we know, it's been very much facilitated by technology. And there is the possibility now that rather than having that big data captured by big organizations or by big institutions, we can allow that data to circulate more widely amongst primary actors so that they can use it to change their lives. So an example that I will share is that in the case of Slum Dwellers International, I didn't talk about them today, but they're an organization that we studied. Much of what they do is they call them horizontal exchanges, and they do demographic surveys. So oftentimes they will spend their very first set of months in forming a group by going shack to shack, house to house, and learning about each family that's living there. And then that data becomes data that belongs to the community. And now they understand who lives there, what are the concerns, what are the needs. And then that data can also be a great advocacy tool, because then they can become a true partner to larger institutions, governments, UN bodies, because they have this enormous amount of data at their disposal, but it still sits within the hands of the community. So rather than being captured again for commercial gain or even just for institutional gain, it becomes part of the community itself. Does that answer your question?
Thank you so much. Okay, for the audience, if you want to, if you have a question or you want to participate or in the discussion, please raise your hand, and I will call on your name, and you can unmute yourself and address your question directly to Cynthia. Okay, just another question about collective identity. It's very interesting the way you talked about this, but I just want to ask, is it something that has to exist organically in the community and you just work on strengthening it? Or could we do it from scratch? Could we build it from scratch? Because in Egypt, for example, in some communities, you can see, especially in Upper Egypt and in the rural areas, you can see there is some sort of community. There is already a social fabric, but unlike in some newly slums in Cairo, for example, you can see that the dwellers, they don't have that much social fabric. They don't relate coming from different places. Is it doable to work on creating a collective identity in such communities, or it has to be already there?
No, I don't. I mean, first of all, there already is an identity in any community, but I think that the real opportunity is to create spaces where those identities can form. So rather than think that you're creating something from scratch where you're going to build the perfect collective identity, that's not the right approach. Rather, the approach should be, what is the collective identity that this group can form for themselves, and giving it space in which to grow. So an important aspect for collective identity formation, well, a couple of things. First of all, it takes time, and it's time that is spent together. Like you said, the newly formed communities have less of an identity than the strong traditional communities, and that's because of time. So over time, collective identity can build, but it needs time, and it also needs space, and that's where that hosting havens tactic comes into play. Organizations are not the I guess they're not the ones who are creating the collective identity. Rather, they're creating the space and the time for those collective identities to form. And I'll go back again to Slum Dwellers International. In the case of SDI, even that act of going from house to house, of spending time as a community to talk to one another, of then in some cases they said it was difficult work because these are not oftentimes houses that are put on a map. You're actually drawing maps. You're creating both a virtual, a conceptual map as well as a physical map of the community. And even that process itself is a strong former of collective identity. In the case of FII, much of their collective identity work was about people identifying friends and family members that they wanted to come into their groups. But then FII provided the technology and the space and the time and the motivation to come together regularly, which then facilitated collective identity formation. I can tell you so many other different stories about how collective identity was formed. It was one of those early aha moments when we were looking at all of these organizations, all of them in different geographies, all of them in different sectors, and yet this one tactic of building collective identity or creating the conditions for collective identity to form was key to each one of them.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Another question, also you brought a very interesting thing about the focus on the process, not the outcomes, and the power dynamics. And this made me think about grant-making foundations and their expectations from their grantees. Do you think that there is an appetite now from donors to support their grantees to focus on learning, to work on the process rather than generate a set of predetermined output, or we still don't have this yet?
Yes, so I think this is a really interesting area and something where that dominant narrative about the industrial approach to social change really does hinder us in being able to approach things from a process-oriented perspective as opposed to an outcomes-oriented perspective. And all of the organizations that we studied have strong outcomes-oriented approaches, but they focus so much on the process. And that was where the big distinguishment is. It's not that outcomes are ignored at all. It's just that process is really part and parcel of their work. And what I think is a great, we talk about this in the chapter that is specifically focused on funding, is that process measures are in fact very tangible and they can be used to see if you're headed in the right direction. And so when we're working in complex adaptive systems, oftentimes it doesn't work to set a very far out goal because, as we noted, we're learning as we go and the system is changing as we go. So when we set those long-term goals, often very technically oriented, we might actually miss something that we're learning along the way, and in fact head in a wrong direction that creates unintended outcomes, unintended consequences, really. And so the idea that you can actually see the process measures along the way is comforting, that you're heading in the right direction. And so what would these process measures look like? I mean, I think the formation of collective identity, you can know if collective identity is being formed if groups continuously come back together. You can know that it's working if there are new ways that are being articulated about the way they see themselves in the world and the activities that they are going to take. In the case of Family Independence Initiative, some of those process initiatives were quite data driven. Are people actually generating more income? Are they generating more businesses? Do they have secure assets? So it doesn't mean that we don't have to move away from data if we're measuring process. It just means that we look at process measures rather than our outcome measures. I also don't want to miss the fact that a lot of this is relational in nature. So, just looking at those data points sometimes can miss the things that really drive why people come together in community over the long term. Often they do it for very intangible things, like it feels good, it's because of love, it's because of community. And these are things that we shouldn't dismiss just because they're difficult to measure. In fact, we should very much try to capture them in qualitative data, in story data, so that we really understand that these things are valuable in and of their own right.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. We have a question from Ahmed. Ahmed, would you please mute yourself and address your comment to Cynthia?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Carmen. Also, thank you for the presentation. Just actually, my comment was about the collective identities, where actually you said that it's very interesting that we build on the collective identities made by the people themselves and the primary actor. But the thing I was like challenging myself in the idea and asking if that the collective identity that the people are creating is against actually what the beliefs or what our work advocate for. And I gave the example of social norms because we are working with people who have, for instance, groups with patriarchal social norms, and they have this identity as within this kind of social norms, and they advocate for it actually. And our work is actually against it, is like to fight this patriarchal social norms and change it to more feminist approach. So here is like you find yourself, you're not building on what they are doing, but it's against what they believe in actually, and you want to actually persuade them to move on from that situation to another. So yeah, that was my reflection.
I think that's a great point, Ahmed. And one of the things that concerned us as we were doing this research is that the tactics that we're talking about don't have to be used in service of progressive ideals. They can also be in service of very conservative or ideals that we wouldn't deem as something we want to promote in terms of positive social change. And so, these are tactics that are can be used in different directions. I would say in terms of collective identity, what you're not just trying to cement relationships that are already in place. So in the case of a community, that might be the existing community. You're trying to create new relationships and put people in configurations that might be different than what they would typically be in contact with. And it's when those new relationships are created that new values can arise, that new ways of being, new ways of seeing the world, new ways of seeing issues such as patriarchy in new ways. So rather than just trying to cement the relationships that are existing in the community, you're trying to expand and or shift the way those relationships currently are. So in fact, putting people in relationships and creating new collective identities around new communities that include new people in new ways could be the answer for that. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you so much, Ahmed, for the question, and thank you, Cynthia. Jack Sim has also an interesting question.
Yeah. How are you, Cynthia?
Jack.
So it's around 2:00 in the morning now, Singapore. Is a compass more important than a roadmap in this case? Because if you have too clear a roadmap, then maybe you kind of stop adapting. How do you feel?
I would agree with that. I think oftentimes the setting of explicit goals, very far off goals that are more than directional, but rather dictate the activity at the activity level, can be very detrimental in complex adaptive systems. They can become checklists rather than actual activities that are driving true change that we want to see. I think in many cases, this is again about staying together while learning. So the main process measure that we can stick to is, are we still together and are we still learning? And when we're learning, are we able to change course if in fact what we're learning tells us that we must or we need to? North Star goals, big goals, they're okay as long as they are not held so tightly that we forget to learn as we go. It's mainly that act of learning. So if in your analogy, the compass, as long as it's giving us a direction and telling us that we're on the right track, then that's wonderful. But if it keeps us wedded to project plans that are no longer applicable, then that's not going to be useful to us.
So how do you handle the funder who says you have to give me specific deliverables And if you fail to deliver those things, then I'm very angry with you because you kind of make me unable to answer to all my bureaucracy. How do you handle that?
Great question. I mean, first of all, we met so many funders who are open to learning, and it's not just the small ones. I think in many cases we found that there are funders who are actively trying to change their behaviors in response to these learnings about complex adaptive systems, but they often don't know what to do. And so they stick to their current ways of behaving and their current ways of operating because they don't have an alternative. So I think in cases where funders are receptive to the conversation, it's really saying, can we learn together? What's the shortest time frame that we can come back to you and tell you what we're learning in case we need to change course? Can we create some points in the project plan where we come together and decide if it's correct to move forward or if there are other ways? And then the other thing I would say that is maybe a little bit more controversial is that if a funder is not willing to learn with you, then they might not be the funder for you. And that's awful to say if you're an organization that is very much seeking funding, but I would say it's not going to be useful if you grow in a way such that you have to deliver to funder needs rather than to the needs of the communities in which you are serving. Yeah, that would be my second point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you, Finta. Dr. Ali has a question.
I'm taking a little bit of maybe your wisdom about. You talked about economies of scale for trust, right? And I kept thinking about when you think in terms of system thinking, you think, for example, points, you think in terms of ripples, you think in terms of disruption. Disruption always starts in the outlier, and then it goes to the mainstream. And I mean, an example actually is even COVID, right? I mean, COVID started with one or two person sort of getting the corona in China, and then all of a sudden exponential growth, and all of a sudden it became mainstream. Now, how do you see those things? How do you? I mean, I see you're focusing more on social, on the connection between people, and how do you get certain attributes like trust to become more dominant or more mainstream, perhaps? But again, I mean, sometimes it starts in the outlier and then it moves in. And I just wanted to see how would you detect this in your approach?
Yeah, great question. And I would say that, in fact, oftentimes these new ways of thinking, new ways of behavior happen at the fringe or as outliers. And really it's those economies of trust, or let's say, rather than economies of trust, which can be a little bit esoteric, let's just talk about the pathways of networks and about trust amongst the relationships of people that have been spending time together over a long period of time and how that grows. Then new ways of being, new ways of thinking, new ways of behavior can travel faster because in fact, these are networks, dense networks of trust. And that's what we found in an organization like SDI. They had built within very small, very localized communities through their data collection, through their self-help group initiatives. They had built very strong networks of community. Then those networks were able to travel to other networks and share the learnings that they had. And because they had both gone through the same process, because they had both subscribed to this larger umbrella network of SDI, they knew that they could trust one another, and they were able to very quickly take what they learned from one group and apply it in the next. So this exponential behavior change happens faster if we have these kind of trusting relationships that they can travel along. And this is entirely different than the kind of factory model of social change that we're used to thinking about, where a program in its perfect, RCT approved way gets replicated over and over again, and we try to keep fidelity to the original model. That's the way we believe that it should happen in a manufacturing or in a service industry context. But what we're talking about instead is social change, which ripples out differently than than production style change.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali, and thank you, Cynthia, again. We have a question from Saleh.
Yeah, hi.
Saleh, please
Hisham.
unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for this fruitful presentation. Is that my colleagues and I have applied for like the map the system competition, and we are trying to fight climate change using resources of like the informal sectors in Egypt. So we are trying to create um, like a new way to fight global or to fight climate change and adapting like these and not adapting and finding out the best path to take, I guess, in order to make these informal sectors as a first line of defense for such uh, like for this problem. So what's your take as an expert, of course, on like how to start communicating or delivering such ideas in order to like achieve this goal of ours? Like for example, we're trying to make green rooftops, for example, or reduce plastics in any way or form, recycling as much as possible, because there are a lot of waste that goes through يعني, uh, a lot of waste goes in these informal sectors. So how can we tackle this problem?
I mean, in mapping that activity, I would think about who is your primary actor in the first case. Who is going to be your primary driver of change? Is it individuals? Is it communities? Is it
individuals in the informal sectors?
So
they make up like 55% of Egypt's population. So there are a lot.
And is there the possibility that a collective identity can be formed around these new behaviors or new technologies or new approaches that mitigate climate change, that you can see them kind of rallying behind or collectively forming together? I mean, rather than thinking about what you want them to do, think about what is it that would drive a point of pride as a group that they can then assume new behaviors that are desirable to your program. So the real thing, and then how do you put them in relationship with one another and with others who can assist, so that they then start to feel that they are mobilizing in support of those objectives. So it's very much it's a social movement style of activity where you're really trying to identify who are those people that need to drive this, who are going to be the drivers of the change. How can they be in relationship with one another? How do we keep them in relationship with one another while they learn and adapt? And then from that, you can use the other practices around platforms, sharing of best practices and that sort of thing. But it really starts with that core group of identifying, helping them identify the collective identity that allows them to shift into these new adaptive behaviors.
All right. Thank you.
I can see that we're out of time. I would love to have this conversation more. There's so much to talk about.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you for this great discussion. I learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you so much. to you, and Cynthia will provide us with the presentation, and we will post it on our website. So please check it out, read it, and thank you so much. We really appreciate you making the time and being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Karman. Thank you very much.
And just as a reminder, I would like to invite you all to attend our webinar on Monday, February 14th. We are hosting Alyssa Gilbert. She's the Director of Policy and Translation in the Imperial College London. We're going to talk about delivering the COP26 Universities Network, Lessons and Legacies. So I would like to see you all on Monday, inshallah. Thank you so much for the great questions and the discussions. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of the day.